The second that idiot signs the marriage certificate, Wagner Group officially changes hands. And her bitch of an older sister. She can be a federal agent all she wants. She'll just have to stand there and watch helplessly. Get the papers ready. Liquidate her mansion the minute the honeymoon is over. Those razor-sharp words came straight from the mouth of Arthur Willis, the perfect fiancé my own sister worshipped like a god. I stood frozen behind the half-closed side door, my chest tightening until I could barely breathe. In my hands, I still clutched the wedding gift. I had to sneak up to the porch. Why sneak? Because just a few days ago, my sister looked me dead in the eye, screamed that I was a bitter, jealous monster, and crossed my name right off the guest list. She had been completely brainwashed by that man severing our blood ties just to protect the guy who was coldly scheduling the slaughter of our entire family over the phone. Arthur thought he won. He thought manipulating my sister and pushing me out of the house cleared his last hurdle. Standing in the dark instead of shedding a single tear for the family bond he trampled on, my hand quietly slipped out my encrypted phone. I hit record. A bone-chilling smile crept onto my lips. My name is Heather Wagner, an investigator for the Criminal Investigation Division. And that bastard has absolutely no idea he only has exactly 21 days left to breathe before I turn his $2 million wedding into a prison with no way out. He thought kicking me off the guest list cut off my eyes and ears. He was wrong. Discipline taught me one thing: when the enemy thinks they are safest, that's when they expose their biggest blind spot. And that blind spot is sitting right here, captured in my audio file. My thumb slid off the phone screen. The audio file locked. Through the narrow crack of the heavy oak door, I watched Arthur loosen his silk tie. He poured himself another glass of bourbon. The crisp clink of ice against crystal echoed into the warm hallway. He kicked off his leather shoes, making himself right at home in the house my grandfather built. Warmth, luxury, a stolen life. I looked down at the black velvet box resting in my palm. Inside was a vintage silver brooch. I bought it 6 months ago. I paid for it using the extra hazard pay I earned sleeping on cots in freezing, unheated tents during my last overseas winter rotation. Every dollar was traded for frostbite and sleepless nights. It was meant to be my sister's something old for her wedding day, a piece of me to walk down the aisle with her. Now I was just a trespasser, an unwanted guest. I bent down and placed the box on the freezing stone step. I set it down gently, no sound. If I kicked that door open right now and confronted him, Arthur would play the panicked victim. He would call the cops, Rose would run down the stairs and shield him. My parents would look at me with that same disappointed glare, asking why I always had to ruin everything. I stepped back. 1, 2, 3. I turned and walked along the wrought iron fence. My boots scraped softly against the fresh snow. Each breath I exhaled plumed into a thick white cloud in the 3-degree Boston air. I didn't look back. I climbed into my Ford F-150. The leather seat was stiff and punishing from the cold. I jammed the key into the ignition and twisted it hard. The engine roared a dry, guttural sound that shattered the quiet street. I threw it in drive and pulled out of the driveway, leaving behind the manicured lawns and the flashing, obnoxious Christmas lights of the wealthy suburbs. My eyes flicked to the passenger seat, empty. A folded fast food bag sat on the floorboard. Half a year ago, when I first came home, Rose sat right there. She hugged me so tight I could barely breathe. Tonight at the family dinner table, my chair was occupied by a man wearing an Italian suit. My parents brushed aside my warnings. They didn't want the ugly truth. They preferred Arthur's cheap compliments about their new window drapes. They liked his perfectly styled hair and his empty promises. They wanted the comfortable illusion. My hands gripped the steering wheel. I squeezed the thick leather until my knuckles turned a bruised shade of white. I took a slow, deep breath, crushing the heavy knot twisting in my chest. You don't cry when you realize you're alone. You count what you have left. You assess the damage. You find the hole in the fence. Arthur Willis just exposed his hole. Arrogance. He looked at my family and saw a flock of sheep without a sheepdog. He thought they were unprotected. The truck tires crunched over the iced pavement as I pulled up to the steel gates of my office building. I swiped my ID card. The heavy metal barrier slowly groaned upward, letting me into the dark parking lot. The bullpen was dead quiet. It smelled like burnt coffee grounds and cheap industrial floor cleaner. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. I walked straight to my desk. I didn't even take off my heavy winter coat. I reached out and aligned 3 paper clips parallel to the edge of my desk. Perfect order. I plugged my encrypted phone into the dual monitor setup. I dragged the raw audio file into the filtering software. Arthur's smooth-lying voice morphed into a jagged green waveform, spiking and dipping across the black screen. I stared at the visual representation of his greed. I created a new folder on the desktop. My fingers hit the mechanical keyboard. The heavy rhythmic clacking echoed off the empty cubicle walls, sharp as gunshots. SUBJECT_WILLIS_ARTHUR. I reached for the secure landline on my desk. I picked up the heavy plastic receiver and pressed it against my cold ear, listening to the flat, continuous dial tone. I punched in a 9-digit number I knew by heart. It was time to dig through the trash this man buried before he ever stepped foot inside my home. I clamped the noise-canceling headphones over my ears and closed my eyes. The sharp hiss of static filled my head. I dragged the playback slider back to the 15-second mark. Liquidate her mansion the minute the honeymoon is over. I listened to the spaces between his words. I tracked his breathing. There was no rush, no stutter. Amateurs planning a con always talk fast. Their pitch spikes on the adrenaline of the steel. Not Arthur. His baritone voice was flat, even almost bored. It was the frictionless tone of a man reciting a script he had chewed on 100 times before. He wasn't robbing a family. He was processing a routine administrative transaction. I opened a battered leather notebook. My pen dug into the thick paper as I wrote the word liquidate, underlining it twice. He didn't want loose cash. He was aiming for the concrete foundation. I pushed my chair back, grabbed a black dry erase marker, and walked over to the whiteboard on the wall. I drew a heavy circle around one name, Rose. Over the past 8 months, Arthur had executed a flawless isolation campaign. I drew a timeline. Month 1, he praised my sister's fierce independence. Month 3, he planted the seeds. Heather only checks your financial reports because she doesn't think you're smart enough to handle them. Month 5, he bought my parents. Paid for their lavish resort trips, poured them expensive wine, and laughed at my father's stale jokes. He built a fence. Inside was the warm, picture-perfect family. Outside was me. My jaw tightened as a memory surfaced like a bad taste in the back of my throat. Last Thanksgiving. The smell of burnt gravy in the kitchen. My mother snatching a plate out of my hands. You look at everyone like they're a suspect, Heather. Learn to be soft. Be gracious. Like Arthur. They handed him the keys to the house because he smiled at them. I walked back to the desk. The cold, bitter dregs of a forgotten coffee burned my throat as I swallowed it down. I picked up the heavy receiver of the desk phone and punched in a 9-digit number. 2 rings. Marcus, I need you. I said, my voice dead flat. Marcus was a federal data guy out in D.C. We spent 2 years freezing in border towns stripping the digital identities off money launderers. He didn't ask questions. I read off Arthur's social security number from my screen. I don't want a criminal background check. Guys wearing suits like his don't leave fingerprints on police records. My eyes stayed locked on the whiteboard. I want deep credit histories, mortgage defaults, annulments or quiet divorces over the last 10 years. Scrape the absolute bottom of the barrel for me. Marcus hung up. No goodbyes. I reached over and pulled the heavy plastic blinds shut. Outside, the Boston skyline was a jagged black silhouette against the pre-dawn smog. I sat back down. My hands moved on their own, finding 3 metal paper clips scattered near the keyboard. I lined them up against the sharp edge of the desk, spaced exactly half an inch apart. It was how I controlled the noise in my head. My parents were fast asleep in a house about to be seized for a debt they didn't owe. My little sister was probably dreaming about her $20,000 wedding gown, completely unaware she was about to be sold for parts. 45 minutes bled away. The silence in the office grew thick, pressing against my eardrums. The blue glare from the dual monitors highlighted the dark, bruised bags under my eyes. Then the screen flashed. A dry, sharp ting echoed in the empty room. The encrypted folder from Marcus sat in my inbox. I hammered the 16-character password into the prompt. The heavy encrypted file cracked open. In the far corner of the dark room, the old office printer woke up. It shrieked, grinding its dry plastic gears before spitting out dozens of pages. The sharp chemical stench of burning toner filled the stale air, mixing with the lingering smell of floor bleach. I walked over, grabbed the warm, heavy stack of paper, and threw it across the glass desk. 2 names glared back at me, slashed in bright yellow highlighter. Chloe Jenkins, Samantha Hayes. A short plain text message from Marcus sat at the very top of the pile. Listen to me. This guy is a leech. He doesn't just bite once and let go. I picked up the first page, my thumb dragging over the fresh ink. Both women used to be engaged to Arthur. One in Chicago 5 years ago, the other down in Austin exactly 3 years ago. I laid their bank records side by side. The pattern was a flawless carbon copy. Arthur didn't kick the door down with a gun. He walked in holding expensive flowers. Both Chloe and Samantha were independent, self-made businesswomen. Arthur played the perfect supportive partner. He sold them the exact same garbage lie he was currently feeding my sister. You work too hard, honey. Let me carry the financial pressure for a while. You just focus on the wedding. The second their bank accounts were merged, the bleeding started. Thick red numbers flooded the financial ledgers. Money vanished into offshore shell companies under the guise of aggressive growth investments. Chloe's logistics business filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy just 6 months after the engagement ring went on her finger. Samantha had to sell her childhood home to cover the massive margin calls he racked up in her name. The biggest, most glaring red flag of all, not a single lawsuit on file. I leaned my weight over the desk. My jaw clenched so tight a sharp pain shot up to my temples. He didn't just drain their bank accounts. He broke them. He bled them so dry, they had absolutely nothing left to fight with. Their pride was shattered into pieces. For a self-made woman, the public humiliation of admitting you were conned by the man sharing your bed is worse than living in poverty. They swallowed the heavy, choking lump of shame and walked away in silence. I saw my sister's face staring back at me from those bankruptcy filings. Rose, so naive, so eager for my parents' approval, so desperate for a picture-perfect romance. She was walking blindly into a financial death sentence. I reached out and pulled the metal desk lamp closer. The harsh white bulb cast deep, ugly shadows across the paper. I read the fine print on the property handover Samantha signed in Austin. The wording was slick, slippery as oil. It didn't look like a theft. It looked like a fully authorized asset transfer. He legally appointed himself as her financial advisor. If the money disappeared, it wasn't a crime. It was just a bad investment strategy, a civil dispute. The police wouldn't even look twice at a piece of paper like this. This was it. This was the exact document Arthur was going to slide across my sister's desk in a few days. He was going to turn the hostile takeover of Wagner Group into a perfectly legal, unfortunate loss. I flipped to the very last page of the Austin file, a notarized property deed. Samantha signing her house over to a holding company. My eyes scanned past the thick black ink stamps down to the bottom right corner. The witness line. Underneath the formal print was a sweeping, elegant signature. I knew that handwriting. I just saw it yesterday on a thick, cream-colored envelope sitting on my parents' kitchen counter. Eleanor Willis, Arthur's mother. The sweet, gray-haired woman who baked a warm apple pie for my mother yesterday afternoon. The woman who sat on our living room couch wiping away tears of joy with a tissue, endlessly praising my sister's beautiful smile. My stomach twisted into a cold, hard knot. Arthur wasn't a lone grifter. I wasn't just dealing with a smooth-talking con artist. I was looking at a professional family crime ring. And they were currently sitting at my parents' dining table, smiling, getting ready to carve us all up. My phone vibrated. 3 sharp consecutive bursts that rattled against the glass desk. It was a secure message from Nadia Brooks, the head of corporate security at Wagner Group. An old friend who knew exactly how to watch my back. The text was short. They're pressing her to sign. I clicked the attached video file. A grainy, low-res feed from the security camera inside the CEO's office filled my screen. Eleanor Willis stood behind my sister's leather chair, gently massaging Rose's shoulders. The camera's cheap microphone picked up the sugary, thick tone of her voice. It sounded like syrup poured over rat poison. I know you're under so much pressure, sweetheart, Eleanor cooed. Heather has always been so cynical, so rigid. Please just let Arthur and me carry this heavy burden for you. You deserve to rest. My hands balled into tight fists. My short nails dug sharp half-moons into my palms. They were using my family's own resentment against me. They knew Rose craved approval. They knew she hated the strict boundaries I tried to set. So Eleanor played the warm, supportive mother-in-law, twisting the knife into the exact spot where my family had already bled me dry. A bald man in a cheap, ill-fitting gray suit walked into the camera frame. He dropped a thick stack of paperwork onto Rose's desk. This is the asset consolidation agreement and the full power of attorney I drafted, the man said. Nadia had slipped a second photo into the message. A blurry snapshot of the man's visitor badge. Gregory Thorne, legal counsel. I dragged his name into the federal licensing database. 10 seconds later, the screen refreshed. Nothing. No bar number. No legal certifications in any state. Gregory Thorne wasn't a lawyer. He was a bottom-feeding scam artist, a professional paper pusher hired to dress up a corporate hijacking in fancy legal jargon. I switched the feed to the hallway camera outside the office. My parents were standing right there by the water cooler. My father was laughing at something Arthur said, patting him affectionately on the shoulder. My mother looked at her future son-in-law with absolute adoration. Bile rose in my throat. I swallowed it down. Hard. They had no idea. Just 10 feet away behind a closed mahogany door, a fake lawyer and a con artist's mother were currently drafting the death certificate for our family's entire legacy. If I drove down there right now, kicked that door open, and flipped that desk, Rose wouldn't thank me. She would call the building guards. She would have me thrown out on the street to protect the man she loved. The brainwashing was complete. They had locked themselves inside a glass cage, and they were happily handing the key over to the wolves. I couldn't save them with warnings anymore, but something was off. Why the rush? The wedding was 10 days away. Why force the power of attorney's signature right now? Career grifters only accelerate the timeline when they are backed into a corner. The screen of my phone lit up again. Raymond Delgado, a private investigator I hired to tail Arthur for the last 3 weeks. I hit the green accept button and put the phone to my ear. The heavy, wet sound of a smoker's cough rattled through the speaker. Ms. Wagner. Raymond rasped his voice thick with cheap tobacco. I just followed your golden boy's son-in-law down to the commercial docks. What is he doing? I asked. He's not shopping for wedding bands, Raymond said. He's meeting with loan sharks. I pulled the Ford F-150 into a gravel lot just past the city limits. The rain fell hard, drumming a steady, heavy rhythm against the roof. Raymond was already there, leaning against the rusty hood of his old sedan. The stale smell of wet tobacco smoke leaked off his heavy coat the second I rolled down the window. He didn't say a word. He just reached through the window and tossed a thick manila folder onto my passenger seat. I flipped it open. The glossy photos were smeared with raindrops, but the image was crystal clear. Arthur. Standing in a filthy brick alleyway down by the commercial docks. The crisp collar of his expensive Italian suit was bunched up in the massive tattooed fist of a man twice his size. Arthur was pinned against the wall, terrified. 800 grand, Raymond said, taking a slow drag from his cigarette. He gambled on phantom derivative markets and lost everything. The margin callers got tired of waiting. They sold his debt to the sharks. He has exactly 3 weeks to clear the ledger, or they start breaking bones. That's why he needs Wagner Group bleeding cash right now. Raymond tapped his ash onto the wet gravel and dropped a second photo on my lap. Arthur sitting in a quiet, upscale coffee shop. Sitting across from him was a woman in a sharp gray blazer. My breath caught. I stopped breathing for 3 full seconds. Victoria Sterling, the director of strategy. My sister's right hand. Rose trusted that woman with her life. Raymond pulled a small digital recorder from his pocket and hit play. The audio crackled, picking up the background clatter of coffee cups before Victoria's icy voice cut through. I've already sliced up the asset portfolio, Victoria said. The emergency reserve funds will be funneled through the shell companies the second the power of attorney clears. My cut is 20%. They were butchering the company right under my sister's nose. The recording kept playing. Arthur's voice came next, dripping with arrogant greed. What about the bitch's mansion? That's prime real estate. Liquidate it, Victoria answered flatly. By the time you two get back from the honeymoon, the deeds will be transferred. The blood roared in my ears. The mansion wasn't just a building on a balance sheet. It was my grandfather's house. It was the garage where he taught me how to fix a slipped bicycle chain with grease on our hands. It was the only piece of my childhood that still held any warmth. And they were treating it like a scrap car at a junkyard. A cold, dead fury settled into my chest. The kind of anger that doesn't scream. The kind that meticulously sharpens a knife in the dark. I couldn't go to the feds with this. To build a solid case on white-collar fraud this deep, the Financial Crimes Division would need 6 months to subpoena the bank records. In 6 months, Wagner Group would be a hollowed-out carcass and my family would be homeless. I shoved the wet photos back into the manila folder. Raymond, pull back, I said, my voice empty of any emotion. Don't follow him anymore. Raymond raised an eyebrow but flicked his cigarette into a puddle. He knew better than to ask. I rolled the window up, sealing myself back inside the quiet cab of the truck. I sat there for a long time, watching the wipers drag heavy sheets of rain across the glass. Have you ever stood in the dark and watched the people you love blindly hand a loaded gun to the person waiting to destroy them? You scream. You warn them. But they just look at you like you're the monster. If you've ever felt that soul-crushing exhaustion of trying to save a family that doesn't want to be saved, do me a favor. Hit the like button right now. Leave a comment below, just drop the word survive. And make sure you subscribe to the channel because I promise you, I'm not letting this guy walk away clean. I reached down and shifted the truck into drive. Arthur thought he was playing a brilliant game of chess. He was about to find out I don't play games. I was going to beat him with the exact same laws he was trying to use to steal my home. I slammed my foot on the gas and tore out of the gravel lot, heading straight for the only lawyer my grandfather ever trusted. The office smelled like dried leather and burnt espresso. Dust motes drifted lazily through the yellow light of a single desk lamp. The radiator hissed in the corner, fighting the bitter Boston chill pressing against the window glass. Patricia Montgomery sat behind a massive mahogany desk. She was the senior trust attorney for Wagner Group. More importantly, she was my grandfather's oldest friend. I dropped the stack of rain-smeared photos, the background check on the fake lawyer, and Raymond's audio recorder right in front of her. Patricia slid her reading glasses down the bridge of her nose. She clicked through the photos. She listened to Arthur and Victoria carve up the company. Her deeply lined face didn't flinch. No gasp of horror. Just the cold, quiet stillness of someone who had spent 40 years watching human greed rot from the inside out. Your grandfather knew Rose was brilliant. Patricia finally said, her voice dry as cracked earth. But he also knew she was glass. Easily shattered, easily led. She stood up. Her heels clicked heavily against the hardwood floor as she walked over to a steel wall safe hidden behind a framed map of old Boston. She spun the brass dial. Click, click, clack. The heavy metal door swung open. She reached inside and pulled out a thick envelope sealed in plastic. She dropped it on the desk. It landed with a heavy final thud. He set up a specific irrevocable family trust before he passed, Patricia said, pulling out a stack of yellowing paper. He left the daily operations to Rose, but he installed a failsafe. She flipped to the very last page and turned it to face me. Any transfer, liquidation, or reassignment of core family assets is automatically voided unless it carries a required countersignature. Patricia tapped a long manicured fingernail against a blank line at the bottom of the page. Yours. I stared at the faded ink. The paper felt thick under my fingers. It smelled like old dust and quiet authority. My chest tightened. A sharp, hot sting flared behind my eyes. For years, my parents pushed me away. They called me rigid, cynical, too harsh for a proper family. But looking at this piece of paper, I realized my grandfather never saw me that way. He didn't see my discipline as a flaw. He saw it as a shield. He knew my parents were weak. He knew Rose was blind. So he handed the heavy iron key to the grand gates of this family, to the one granddaughter everyone else treated like a stray dog. I swallowed the heavy lump in my throat. I didn't cry. I reached inside my coat jacket and pulled out a heavy silver fountain pen. "If I activate this trust," I said, my voice dead flat, "every power of attorney document Arthur hands my sister becomes worthless trash." Patricia gave a slow, deliberate nod. "Not worth the ink printed on it." I clicked the cap off my pen. I skimmed the heavy legal paragraphs, my eyes tracking the absolute lockdown of the Wagner estate. I pressed the metal nib to the paper. The metal scratched aggressively against the thick parchment, a harsh scraping sound in the quiet room. I signed my name 3 times, fast, sharp, permanent. An invisible steel wall just slammed down around the entire company. Arthur was out there right now, smiling, drinking expensive bourbon, thinking he was holding a royal flush. He had no idea he was standing inside a bank vault that just locked from the inside. I capped my pen and set it down. Patricia gathered the signed documents, her hands moving with quiet, methodical precision. She slipped them back into the heavy envelope. "Everything is in place, Heather." Patricia locked the safe and turned back to the window, looking out at the dark city streets. "Now we just wait for the rat to walk into the cage." 3 days before the wedding, my apartment was pitch black except for the cold, harsh glare of the laptop screen. The air felt stale and heavy. Nadia had given me backdoor access to the corporate security feeds. I sat perfectly still in the dark, watching a tragedy unfold in real time. The CEO's office was suffocating with expensive red roses. Rose sat behind the massive mahogany desk. She looked exhausted. Beautiful but completely hollow. Her eyes kept drifting to the empty leather sofa in the corner of the room. My spot. The place I used to sit with a cup of bitter black coffee, reviewing her vendor contracts, keeping the wolves at the door. Now it was just an empty piece of furniture. And the wolves were already inside the room, circling her chair, smelling blood. Gregory Thorne, the fake attorney, slid a thick stack of papers across the glass desk. The asset consolidation agreement and the full power of attorney. Arthur stood right behind Rose. He placed his heavy manicured hands on her tense shoulders, rubbing them slowly, playing the patient, loving savior. Eleanor stood by the window, dabbing her perfectly dry eyes with a laced tissue. The static hiss of the cheap camera microphone picked up her sickly sweet voice. "We are just so proud of you, Rose," Eleanor cooed, "making these hard sacrifices for your family's future." My parents sat on the opposite couch. My father nodded along, completely clueless. My mother offered a warm, approving smile. They were willingly handing over the keys to our entire bloodline because the thieves asked nicely. It made my stomach turn, a sickening display of blind trust. Rose picked up the heavy fountain pen. She paused. Just for 1 second. Her eyes skimmed over the dense legal jargon she didn't understand. She looked up at Arthur. He gave her that perfect practice smile. A lie wrapped in a tailored Italian suit. She lowered her head. She signed the first page, then the second, then the third. I watched my sister willingly put a noose around her own neck. She was signing away my grandfather's sweat and legacy, trading it all for a man who owed his soul to back-alley loan sharks. As the black ink dried on the final signature line, Arthur let out a long, heavy breath. A visible wave of relief washed over his broad shoulders. The heavy anchor of his $800,000 debt just vanished. He leaned down and kissed the top of Rose's head, a Judas kiss reeking of betrayal. Gregory snatched the papers off the desk. He shoved them into his cheap leather briefcase and snapped the brass locks shut. Arthur stepped over to the wet bar. He pulled a green bottle of imported champagne from the silver ice bucket. His thumbs pressed hard against the cork. Pop. The sharp crack echoed through my laptop speakers, followed by a chorus of forced laughter and the delicate clinking of crystal glasses. They were toasting. Toasting to the easiest heist of the century. Toasting over the grave of a young woman's pride and a family's total ignorance. I stared at the grainy screen for 5 more seconds. I didn't slam my fist against the desk. I didn't scream at the empty walls. I reached forward and quietly folded the laptop shut. The room plunged back into absolute darkness. I stood up, walked into my bedroom, and pulled open the closet door. I reached past my everyday clothes and unzipped the heavy plastic garment bag hanging in the back. I pulled out my formal dress uniform, the heavy dark wool jacket, the polished brass buttons. I ran my hand down the sleeve, pressing my thumb hard against the razor-sharp crease in the fabric until it dug painfully into my skin. Enjoy the cheap champagne, Arthur. Drink up. The clock just ran out. I stood perfectly still in front of the full-length mirror in my bedroom. The early morning light filtered through the blinds, casting pale gray lines across my formal dress uniform. The heavy dark wool felt stiff, protective. I buttoned the thick brass buttons one by one. I smoothed down the sharp ironed creases on my shoulders. On my left chest, a single row of medals caught the light. I wasn't carrying a weapon, but I knew exactly how sharp the presence of authority could cut through a room full of soft, entitled people. I pulled my hair back, tying it into a tight, neat knot at the base of my neck. I wasn't walking into that church today as the ungrateful daughter. I wasn't the jealous older sister they scratched off the guest list. I was the executioner. An hour later, I stood in the small vestibule of St. Peter's Church. The heavy oak doors were pulled shut, but the frosted glass panels let me see the blurry shapes inside. The sanctuary was packed with 300 guests, the Boston elite. The air bleeding through the cracks of the door smelled sickeningly sweet, a thick, suffocating cloud of expensive floral perfume and burning wax candles. Through the crack, I saw Rose. She looked flawless in a white silk gown, but her eyes kept nervously darting toward the front row, toward the empty wooden chair sitting right next to my parents. My mother and father sat close together. My mother looked down, her hands tightly clutching a lace handkerchief. Up on the marble altar, Arthur stood tall and arrogant. He shot his cuffs, adjusting the expensive gold links at his wrists. He looked out over the crowd with a sickeningly proud smirk. He thought he was untouchable. He was just minutes away from legally securing the keys to the Wagner estate. The gentle hum of the organ faded out. The ceremony began. Everything flowed perfectly, just like a rehearsed stage play. The priest's deep, soothing voice echoed off the vaulted stone ceiling, reciting the sacred vows. The entire room fell into a heavy, reverent silence. It was a beautiful, expensive lie. I raised my right hand. I wrapped my bare fingers around the freezing brass handle of the heavy oak door. Inside the sanctuary, the priest paused. He took a slow breath. If anyone here has reason why these two should not be joined in holy matrimony. The priest echoed the traditional empty formality hanging in the quiet air. Speak now or forever. Hold your peace. Absolute silence blanketed the church. Nobody expected an answer. I pushed the heavy oak doors open. Crack! The sound was a dry, hollow thud that shattered the holy silence. I stepped over the threshold. The heavy heels of my uniform shoes struck the marble floor. Click, clack, hard, rhythmic, and perfectly straight. I didn't look at the crowd. I kept my eyes locked dead ahead. 300 heads turned at exactly the same time. A collective gasp sucked the air right out of the room. My mother's hands flew to her mouth, tears instantly spilling over her eyelashes. Rose's eyes widened in absolute shock. Her fingers trembled so hard the expensive bouquet of white lilies slipped from her grip and hit the floor. Have you ever dreamed of walking straight into a room full of people who dragged your name through the mud, looking them dead in the eye and letting them know their lies are over? If you know exactly how heavy that moment feels, do me a favor right now. Hit the like button. Drop the word justice in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel because the look on this guy's face is something you don't want to miss. Arthur's arrogant smirk melted off his face. His skin turned a sickly pale shade of ash gray. The fake charming gentleman vanished. He lost his mind. He pointed a shaking finger straight at me, his voice cracking violently as he screamed over the altar. Security, get her out of here. Security, who let her in here? Arthur yelled. His polished, wealthy charm completely shattered. His voice cracked high and desperate. I didn't blink. I didn't break my stride. I walked straight down the center aisle, ascending the 3 marble steps onto the altar. Nadia stepped out from the side aisle. She stood with her arms crossed, wearing a sharp black blazer. She shot a cold look at the 2 hired security guards near the door, giving them a subtle shake of her head. They stayed put. I pulled my encrypted phone from my pocket. I grabbed the wireless microphone off the pulpit, jamming it right against the phone's speaker. Sorry I'm late, Rose, I said. My voice echoed through the massive church, slicing right through the frantic whispering of the crowd. But I brought a wedding gift. I figured you should open it in front of everybody. I pressed play. A harsh, high-pitched feedback whine ripped through the speakers, followed immediately by Arthur's voice. Cold. Arrogant. Dirty. The second that idiot signs the marriage certificate, Wagner Group officially changes hands. And her bitch of an older sister. She can be a federal investigator. All she wants, she'll just have to stand there and watch helplessly. Get the papers ready. Liquidate her mansion the minute the honeymoon is over. The words boomed off the vaulted ceilings. Rose collapsed. Her knees simply gave out. She hit the floor, pressing both hands hard over her mouth. Her eyes were wide with pure, suffocating horror as she stared up at the man she almost married. The church erupted. 300 guests gasped in unison. Heavy wooden pews groaned and scraped against the floor as people shifted in shock. Arthur's face turned the color of wet cement. Heavy beads of sweat broke out across his forehead. Backed into a corner with his entire scam exposed to the Boston elite, he snapped. He let out a guttural roar and lunged at me, his fist pulled back. He didn't even get within 3 feet of my uniform. Nadia and 2 plainclothes security men stepped in front of me. They caught Arthur mid-lunge, twisted his arm sharply behind his back, and slammed him down. His perfectly styled face hit the cold marble floor with a sickening smack. Before the crowd could even process the struggle, Patricia Montgomery stood up from the front row. She walked to the altar and threw a heavy stack of legal documents onto the pulpit. She adjusted her glasses, staring down at Arthur's squirming body. "To Arthur Willis," Patricia announced, her voice booming with absolute legal authority. "The power of attorney you forced my client to sign 3 days ago is completely void. Wagner Group assets are locked inside an irrevocable family trust. Without the countersignature of Heather Wagner, you cannot take so much as a paperclip from this family." She didn't stop there. "We are also fully aware of the $800,000 debt you owe to unlicensed lenders." Patricia continued, looking out into the crowd. "We know about your accomplice, Victoria Sterling." In the third row, Victoria turned ghost white. She covered her face with her hands, shaking uncontrollably. "And we know the lawyer who drafted your paperwork is a fraud," Patricia finished. The social ruin was absolute. I looked down at the front pews. Eleanor Willis, the sweet pie-baking mother-in-law, had lost all the color in her face. She didn't look at her son. She didn't try to help him. She quietly grabbed her designer purse, kept her head down, and practically ran toward the side exit, leaving her boy pinned to the floor. The guests started standing up. The whispers turned into disgusted muttering. They grabbed their coats and headed for the doors, stepping over the discarded flower petals. I walked over to where Arthur was pinned against the marble. I crouched down, getting right next to his ear. "Touching my sister," I whispered, keeping my voice dead even. "That was the last mistake you'll ever make." The sharp, high-pitched wail of sirens pierced the freezing Boston air. The flashing red and blue lights reflected off the stained glass windows, growing fainter as the local authorities dragged Arthur Willis away in handcuffs. Inside, St. Peter's, the heavy oak doors remained wide open. The sanctuary was a ghost town. The air was thick with the smell of burnt-out wax candles and nervous sweat. White lily petals lay crushed and bruised against the cold marble floor, trampled by the heavy boots and designer heels of fleeing guests. Rose sat collapsed on the front wooden pew. Her $20,000 silk wedding dress was ruined, smeared with gray dirt from the floor. She was hyperventilating. Her chest heaved as she sobbed, her hands gripping the wooden bench so hard her knuckles turned white. My parents stood 5 feet away. They just stared at me. Their eyes were bloodshot, heavy with a crushing, suffocating guilt. My mother kept opening her mouth, but no sound came out. They couldn't even take a step toward me. The brutal truth had finally broken their stubborn pride. They realized they had thrown away the only person willing to stand in front of a speeding train for them all to protect a smooth-talking con artist who gave them cheap compliments. Rose dragged herself up from the pew. She stumbled over, her legs shaking, and buried her wet face against the heavy wool of my uniform jacket. Her hands desperately grabbed my leather belt. "I'm sorry. I'm so stupid, Heather. I'm so sorry." She choked out, her voice cracking into an ugly, ragged whisper. I didn't yell. I didn't spit out a bitter. I told you so. The burning anger in my chest was just gone, replaced by a hollow, quiet exhaustion. I reached down. My rough, calloused right hand rested on her messy blonde hair. I smoothed it down once, just once. The forgiveness didn't need to be spoken. I gently pried her trembling fingers off my belt. I stood her up straight, placed my hands on her shoulders, and pushed her toward our parents. My mother caught her, pulling her into a tight hug. I took a slow, deliberate step backward. I put a solid physical boundary between us. I saved their house, but the deep crack in this family's foundation would take years to patch. The legal earthquake hit 3 days later. Patricia Montgomery didn't just lock the family trust. She went straight for the throat. Chloe and Samantha, the two women Arthur financially ruined in Chicago, and Austin finally found their nerve. They stepped out of the shadows and filed joint fraud charges. The entire Willis family was looking at decades in a federal penitentiary, assuming the angry loan sharks didn't get to them in the holding cells first. Gregory Thorne caught a heavy forgery indictment. Victoria Sterling was fired, stripped of her corporate licenses, and permanently blacklisted from the financial sector. Monday morning. I stood in the corner of my small apartment, pressing a hot iron over the sharp creases of my work shirt. The sudden hiss of steam filled the quiet room. I slipped the shirt on, buttoning it up to the collar. I picked up a heavy ceramic mug of black coffee, letting the bitter heat seep into my cold palms. I walked out the front door. The morning air was biting, freezing my breath into thick white clouds, but my chest felt completely clear. The absolute worst enemies don't break through your windows in the dark. They walk through the front door holding expensive flowers. They use love to brainwash you and tear your family apart from the inside. My encrypted phone buzzed in my coat pocket. A secure text from the downtown office. A brand new case file waiting on my desk. I climbed into the freezing cab of my Ford F-150, twisted the key, and listened to the engine roar to life. I merged into the heavy morning traffic, ready to go back to work. Thank you so much for listening to my story, and my deepest, most respectful goodbye to all of you who have stood by me.